Welcome to Hub Hits. Rudyard Griffiths here, special guest in studio, Kory Teneycke, president, co-founder of Rubicon Strategies, campaign manager, Doug Ford in the last three elections. Kory, thanks for coming into Hub HQ.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Want to do two things with you today on the show. Talk about federal politics. Parliament's coming back mid-September, and I want to focus on the two protagonists, the two major protagonists, Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. So let's begin with Mark Carney. What are you going to be looking for in those early weeks when Parliament comes back to get a sense of like the tone and direction and I guess the leadership style of this relatively new Prime Minister?
Well, I think he's got a lot on his plate right now that we'll see what it looks like when the House comes back. But I think they've raised expectations very high, both during the election campaign and in the months over the summer and leading into the summer. Things like internal free trade in Canada. You know, everyone's talked about it for decades. And there's a reason why it hasn't really happened before. It's quite difficult. It's quite a hard thing to do. And so, you know, the legislation around that, what does it look like? Where are the trade-offs? Not everyone is going to be happy. You know, everyone is happy at a high level when you say, you know, we're going to do more trade within Canada, but then there are real consequences and trade-offs and things that happen. And not every constituency out there in every part of the country is going to love what that looks like if it comes to pass. So, you know, that's one small area. The much bigger area, I think, is around these major projects. And I think it's easy to have a lot of support from premiers and across the country and from Canadians generally when it looks like you're going to be able to do everything on everyone's wish list. I doubt that will be true in the end. And so which projects are you proceeding with, which aren't, are you not? And what does the rest of the world think of that? We've already seen some tension with First Nations around what is consultation, you know, what is adequate consultation. You know, that is where I think this is probably going to have its most problematic area. And in that legislation, what is the litigation risk around it? You know, is all this going to be trapped in the courts for years, or stalled or encumbered with requirements that they've imposed? I think that's where it's going to be a lot more challenging. So, which projects do they choose? What does internal free trade look like? And then I guess the last big element would be is where are we at with the United States on trade? And it kind of feels like pieces are moving on the board right now, but do they result in a deal? You know, we've seen Canada make some concessions, some which I think you and I are probably pretty happy about, like the digital services tax, which I myself and I think many conservatives and many people who aren't conservative have thought that was a pretty ill-advised approach. But in giving that up, you know, has it advanced the trade negotiations? I guess no one really knows, right? We don't have a deal. But like, let's, I guess, see what happens around that as well. That's less about what happens in Parliament and more what happens with Dom LeBlanc and the Prime Minister and folks in Washington. But what we've seen in other countries is not encouraging.
Yeah. Let's talk about the budget. There are, you know, numbers getting circulated out there that it could be a big deficit. I've heard numbers as high as $92 billion on the deficit. How does that play politically? Do voters care about this? Interest rates on longer duration Canadian debt have remained high over the course of this year. The 5-year, all-important 5-year Canadian mortgage bond is roughly where it is at the big as it was in January, despite, you know, ongoing cutting by the central bank at the front end of the bond curve. So, Kory, these things matter. Large levels of debt and indebtedness lead to higher borrowing costs across society, from consumers to corporations to governments. But does that matter? Does Mark Carney need to keep an eye on just how big this budget's going to get?
Well, I think he does have to worry about that. I think one of the other areas where you've seen the Conservatives score some points in the past, and I think continue to have opportunities, is around cost of housing and the number of housing starts that we see. housing starts have largely stalled out. We have, we're shooting this here in Toronto. We've got 25,000 empty condos that can't be sold right now, and we'll probably have 10,000 more by the end of the year. That's a challenge. A, they're not very nice units in many cases, and B, they're unaffordable for the type of family or person who would be, well suited to live in that kind of space. So I think there's more corrections to come. I think there's potential for bankruptcies in that sector of the economy. But the political driver on that is there are a lot of Canadians who are younger who don't think they will ever own a home of their own. And until we're able to increase supply and bring costs down, that's going to continue to be a political driver. And so there's politics in that for sure.
Yeah. Carney's leadership style, what do you make of it? There was some sense around the Air Canada strike that maybe there were members of his caucus that weren't all too excited about seeing Air Canada air attendants kind of forced back to work. He has this progressive wing in the party. How does he hold that, especially if this budget is going to be a big flex economically, maybe a flex along some lines that are not entirely built around progressive principles, like more pipelines or things that don't really resonate with, again, a portion of the electorate that he was successful in holding to the Liberal Party during the campaign and was a big part of his very strong minority government.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think it's a complicated answer as to what's going on there, and it touches on Poilievre, which I guess we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah.
The Carney government looks a lot more like a fourth term of Stephen Harper than a fourth term of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
And so that has created, you would think, a lot of room on the left. But you're seeing simultaneously the NDP essentially disappear.
Yeah.
And so why has that happened? Well, I think there are a couple of things that have gone on. One, the Conservatives, you've seen this provincially with Ford and others, but you've seen it with Poilievre as well. A portion of the traditional NDP base that drive an F-150 and have steel-toe boots they wear to work and shower at the end of the day, not the beginning of the day, that kind of blue-collar skilled trades side of the party have long been cultural conservatives.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing them actually see some commonality politically with conservative parties who they feel are speaking more to the issues that they care about than the NDP have. So they've lost a chunk of their support already to the Conservatives. So it's sort of weird. The collapse of the NDP is part of that is being a gain for Conservatives. But the other factor is political choices are a relative comparison. And if you look at some of the other voters that would typically vote for the NDP who are voting for Carney, who, let's just be frank, he's like a Bay Street, guy, a central banker. He
wears, $1,000 shoes to gay pride parades.
Right, exactly. that sort of thing. You wouldn't think that makes sense. But I think the support for the Liberals from those voters is a reaction to Poilievre more than anything else. So I was listening to interest with a conversation you and Sean Spear were having about, look at how well Poilievre has done at collapsing the PPC vote. Well, you can look at, I'll use the Doug Ford example, not at all trying to collapse that vote, but that vote collapsed for him as well, and virtually every other Conservative leader. So I'm not sure you need to do a lot about that. But the cost of spending too much time in the manosphere and things like that is it's scared the crap out of a whole chunk of progressive voters that are motivated to vote for the Carney Liberals, not because they love what's on the policy agenda. They want to stop Conservatives for winning because they find whether it's stylistic elements of Poilievre or whether it's policy elements, I would say it's far more stylistic, given that I think the Venn overlap on Carney and Poilievre in the last election campaign from a policy perspective was mild, right? Like they almost complete overlap. So The reaction to some of the stylistic things I think the Conservatives have done and some of the approach they've taken in communication have driven progressive voters into the arms of a very unlikely candidate, Mark Carney.
Yeah. Perfect segue to talk about our other big protagonist as Parliament comes back, and that's Pierre Poilievre. He's back in the House. What's your advice? Is it time for a big reset? You could look at some of these recent poll numbers, say, coming out of Abacus, that would suggest the Conservatives continue to have an edge on affordability, on housing, on some of their traditional perceived kind of policy competencies. Does he double down on that, or does he try to build credibility on areas where he wasn't scoring high in those polls, which is Trump, which is trade, which are some of the other big concerns that Canadians have right now?
Yes, you have to do more than one thing. We'll come back to the NDP issue. I've seen a lot of back patting around getting 42% of the vote. Well, that's a really great number in a three-party race. It's a really inadequate number in a two-party race.
Right.
And I would posit that we're probably, for the foreseeable future, in a two-party race. And so you have to figure out, what is your voter coalition going to look like? Who can you bring into your fold? I think the lowest hanging fruit is unlikely to be affordability voters. I think they're with they're with Poilievre already, and I think they're likely to stay there. You can't completely ignore those issues and those people, but the story of the election campaign is the loss of 55-plus voters, which is the core of every Conservative voting coalition in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And to lose both men and women, but particularly men, that is shocking. And that is around other things.
Yeah. What things, Kory? What do you think those voters saw in Mark Carney that they felt were absent in Pierre Poilievre? And does he can he credibly become a substitute again for those voters?
Well, I think they're different for men than women. Obviously I'm generalizing here. But I think for a lot of male voters, it was resume. And let's just say the obvious. These resumes are not at all similar. You've got somebody who's had some jobs in politics and has really never had any private sector experience of any sort versus somebody who's, had some of the largest jobs in the economy that you can have. And so when you're looking at for those voters, it's like, well, I like some of the things you're saying, but I just don't view you as a credible alternative as a candidate. So what do you do about that? He's not going to go and Poilievre isn't going to go and get a job at Goldman Sachs and beef up his resume.
No.
But what you can do is broaden out your team. And so I like to use I'll mix match superhero storylines here, but they pursued very much a Superman storyline,
right?
Where it's Pierre for Prime Minister, and it's all Pierre all the time, all channels, all media.
Yeah.
That's one approach. I think when you're up against Trudeau, that can be a really winning approach. Yeah. But when you're up against Carney, if you're Poilievre, I don't think that's a winning approach. I think you need to make an Avengers movie. You need to have a team of superheroes, and look at the Avengers. They're led by Captain America, a guy who has basically no superpowers.
Right.
Took some steroids, I guess.
Yeah. Cool shield.
Cool shield. But you're going to do a lot better if you got Thor and the Incredible Hulk and Iron Man and the whole team. And there are some really talented people within that Conservative caucus and within the Conservative movement more generally. So whether you're talking about premiers or other allies. Broaden out your appeal and your team. And I think that's one of the paths to try to buttress against that Carney effect around resume. For women, I think it's a different thing. And this relates more to Trump. I think stylistically, Poilievre can appear too Trumpian for those voters. I think he's kind of off-putting. I think he spends a little bit too much time in the manosphere and talking to Jordan Peterson, who, is somebody who has a lot of appeal for certain Conservative voters.
Right. But he's already got those voters.
He's already got those voters. But he, the sort of Peterson sort of environment is pretty radioactive to a lot of women.
Right.
And the rhyming and the name calling and things like that. That I think it's off-putting to voters generally outside of your partisan core. Because it's hard to say those things and do those things without coming across as a bit of a jerk.
Yeah.
And this gets to likability, which is if you're looking at best prime minister or favorability ratings,
his negatives are high.
Like it's the Liberals are roughly 10 points up right now on ballot, but they're 20 to 30 points up on best prime minister and likability.
Yeah.
So these things kind of come together, I think, in what I would say would be a good strategy for them. One, broaden out your team. Some of those people on the team can do some of the spade work that you need to do to bring down your opponent's favorability. But what's wrong with having a Melissa Lantsman or someone like that out throwing the haymakers and throwing the spears at your opponent, and save the slightly more statesman-like appeal for the leader himself? I think that's an obvious thing to do to improve your favorability. And I think it creates a little bit of brand differential from Trump, who's really the dominant figure in the news most days in Canada. If you're looking and sounding a lot like Trump with the name calling and the sort of snide remarks to reporters, you're putting yourself in that negative environment, and I think it creates headwinds for you that are unnecessary. So I think it's a combination of those two things: softening of his appeal and broadening it out of the team presentation.
Yeah. Final question: what's your advice for what Pierre Poilievre should do with regards to the budget? Some would say that, look, he's the leader of the official opposition; he should oppose. That should be their stance. In fact, some would say that's their responsibility. Maybe politically it creates some advantages because the NDP get wedged into supporting a budget, because the last thing they're ready to do is go to an election, and they now own a lot of the Bobby Banker kind of policy preferences that maybe Mark Carney will express in the budget. The other option could be, again, more of a statesman-like approach and say there are some good ideas in this budget. There are ideas in this budget that are conservative ideas, and therefore we will support it. It's going to be a consequential decision. Where do you come down?
I guess we'd have to see what's in the budget to decide where you draw that line. If wrapped up in the budget are major infrastructure projects that are broadly popular with the conservative voting base, then that's going to probably lead you more towards support. If it's a bunch of spending and a vague notion of what projects are going to proceed or what the upside of that is, then I think there's a much better case to argue that the additional spending isn't delivering the results that people need, and it comes with other negative consequences, crowding other money out of the system, et cetera. So in that case, you're probably not going to support it. I think generally leaders of the opposition are going to default to vote against the budget. And I'd be pretty surprised if the Conservatives don't. But that doesn't mean that everything they say about it needs to be negative. Right. So I guess we'll see around that. At the end of the day, the voters out there that are going to vote on the size of the deficit, the Conservatives already have, I would say, by and large. And so you got to figure out how you're going to, change the conversation around that a little bit. I think the biggest opportunity that I see for the Conservatives is around execution on some of these major projects. When we're talking about Trump and trade and all of that, I think there's a notion that Trump is unpredictable. It's unlikely anyone's going to get a deal that lasts, et cetera. And so that kind of becomes a wash. But on the major projects, I think the Conservatives maintain a higher level of credibility that they can get those things done.
Right.
And Carney has largely taken the Poilievre plan and is trying to execute on it. Well, there could be a case to be made that the person who came up with that plan would execute on that plan better than the person who borrowed it at the 11th hour. And I think that's a much more fertile piece of ground to plant your garden in if you're the Conservatives right now.
Okay. Smart analysis, great insights as always. Kory Teneycke, Rubicon Strategies. Thanks for coming on Hub Hits.
My pleasure.
If you're watching on our YouTube channel, thank you for joining the over 500,000 viewers that have been on in the last short period of time. Click on the subscribe button and the notification bell. We'll send you our next Hub Hit as soon as it's published. And if you're one of the over 250,000 people who have downloaded a Hub podcast in the last 30 days, you're in great company, great taste. Please write a review. Tell us what you think about what you're hearing on the Hub's podcast channel. We always appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for watching and listening. Until next time, I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Bye-bye.